Welcome to In Conversation With, the part of the channel where we'll be diving deep into topics by sitting down with the people who know them best. Each episode will bring you an unscripted, genuine chat with either a local campaigner, a leader, or someone with a story of how local politics works or doesn't. This will hopefully give you an insider's perspective that you won't find anywhere else. In this first episode, we'll be starting to pull back the curtain to reveal the surprising truths and untold stories that happen behind doors of local government. So, join us as we delve into the fascinating, sometimes disturbing, yet always intriguing world of local government. And to help us navigate this intricate world, we have a truly insightful guest joining us today, Dan Boatright-Greene. Dan currently sits as a district councillor for Wychavon and a county councillor for Worcestershire. Dan brings a grounded perspective to the challenges and triumphs of local politics. He's been on the front lines dealing with everything from environmental concerns to supporting vulnerable residents, and he's not afraid to speak his mind or to speak candidly about the realities of working within the system. Welcome to the episode.
Thank you, and thank you for that interesting introduction.
I think it's a fair introduction. You are known for speaking your mind and speaking very candidly about subjects, which is always welcomed in local politics.
Yeah, I think it's something I sometimes forget is that it's quite a common misconception that everyone is well scripted and preparing their speeches over periods of time and making sure it's all perfectly politically. And I'll be the first to admit that I am known for probably being slightly more outspoken than most Liberal Democrats.
And that is quite valuable at times. So as we delve into this, I suppose the first question to get to is there's been a lot of change in local politics, particularly at the county council level. So for those who aren't as perhaps intimately familiar with our local political scene, could you perhaps paint a picture of what we've had and the background to where we've been for the last sort of 4 years and where we are at the moment and where that might be going?
Absolutely. So your county council, for those of us who are not necessarily as clued up, we have 57 councillors democratically elected every 4 years. So we've just been through the election cycle in 2025. And previously, when I was first elected, it was 2021, just after COVID, which was an interesting experience to be elected into. In 2021, we very much were living through the Nadeem Zahawi bounce for the Conservatives, where they'd had the vaccinations, everything was going really well. And so it was 45 out of 57 councillors elected were all from the Conservatives, which made the council incredibly one-sided on all fronts. It meant that the leadership, all of the cabinet positions, so the people who are making the day-to-day decisions, there's about 11 of those, they were all from the Conservatives. And at the same time, the people who were marking their homework, the people who were chairing scrutiny, almost all of them were, all of them were Conservatives, bar the one that was constitutionally had to be from the opposition. And that made it very difficult because it meant that of the 12 of us who were not Conservatives, our voices were considered to be irrelevant. And it was quite a toxic environment. A lot of people unwilling to listen to each other. A lot of problems with what I would consider to be shouting down, belittling, and a lot of, you're playing politics if we didn't agree. No real opportunity to negotiate with one another, no real opportunity to have honest and frank conversations about what it was we wanted to bring to the table, which meant that, in all fairness, it was pretty much a bin fire in terms of any sort of communication between any groups. It was aggressive.
Nice visual idea there. Yeah.
It really was. And it got worse as time went on because the Conservatives were so unimaginably stressed by the fact that they were losing control of the finances, in part because of what was happening with local government overall, where government funding has been cut, but at the same time the choices they'd made over 20 years had actually cornered us. So they had made decisions about not raising council tax when they needed to, hoping that the kind of cavalry would ride in on their noble steeds and solve it for them, not realising, of course, that they had 14 years of their noble steeds in Parliament, and not a single one of them ever said, "Do you know what we should do? We should fund local government properly."
Which is an ongoing problem which the new administration are going to have to tackle.
Yes.
Which obviously nicely segues us into what happened in May.
So, in May, I think a lot of people weren't expecting this. Those of us who were in politics could see it coming. And I was preparing for us going into no overall control. So basically, no overall control means that of the 57, there's no party with a majority. So in our case, it's 28. Having a majority of one is incredibly dangerous. So really, you want 29, 30, 31, really just to make sure you've got a majority. And instead, what we've got is we're in overall control with I think the Conservatives losing. I think it was about 2/3, if not more, of their seats. I think they were sitting on 37 by the end because a lot of them had defected or become independents, or they'd lost seats in elections, and they're down to 12. Lib Dems went up. We doubled in size to 6, which was great. So we're happy. Could have got a couple more, but we'll get there. We'll get there. And Reform are now the largest group. And this has made it quite difficult because although they're the largest group, they are led by a former Conservative, and there are several Conservatives in their management structure. They also, a lot of them have never been in politics before, which is not a bad thing, because I do think that people who've come into politics from elsewhere, myself included, we come in with different skills, different ideas, different concepts. Exactly, John, you're in that boat as well. So, this idea that we're somehow kind of like political animals, it's not true. We're actually people who are, regular people who kind of, go about our daily lives when we're not doing this sort of thing. And actually, we bring a wealth of expertise and knowledge. And unfortunately for Reform, I think that's something that they haven't really understood yet. They think that all of us who are in other parties, we're politicians, but they're not. And that's made any sort of negotiations really difficult. Because when I'm not sitting here with you, I jointly own a wine bar. We own a family wine bar, effectively. I was a teacher for 11 years. I also have a day job where I help train people. So it's one of those where I bring a wealth of different skills to the table, and they don't really understand that.
No, and they made a comment in the last meeting about career politicians, which you quite rightly picked up on. And you listed, you said that you had 3 jobs. So the idea of being a career politician was quite wrong. And like you, I run a local business. I run a charity that is actively engaged in the community. So that's how I sort of ended up dragging in. And I think you're right in that there's that little bit of misunderstanding between actually how things work. And I think people look at it and think that councils are inherently political, and they don't understand how political parties and independent councillors, because there are a couple this time round, how perhaps they work with each other or sometimes don't work with each other to make sure the day-to-day functioning of the council works. So looking at that, how do you rationalize how people are working with each other or not?
So when you're in overall control, you very simply have to talk to each other. And if you want something done, you need to basically put your chips on the table and say, this is what I'd like to do. And is it possible we can work together to achieve this? I think what really stunned me was the first phone call I had, and it was with the deputy leader. The leader has never actually spoken to me. So I'm group leader of the Lib Dem group. And I've spoken to all the leaders of the other groups, but I've never actually had Joe Monk actually call me or arrange a meeting with me. It's always been the deputy, which I do find very strange.
Okay.
And I ended up on a 52-minute call. Well, it was actually a lot longer, but it was 52 minutes of him telling me that we have lots in common and there's lots we can do, and how politics, should be set aside, etc., etc. And for 52 minutes, he kept telling me that we had loads in common and there was lots we could achieve. It was at the 52-minute mark that I finally lost my patience and just said, yes, like what? Tell me what we have in common, and I will gladly work with you on this. And what it came down to was, what he was calling me for was for me to support what Reform wanted to do, which was basically do exactly what the Conservatives did. So have all of the cabinet positions, have the leader, mark their own homework and have all the chairs of scrutiny. They wanted to have the chair of the council, so they had the deciding vote if it was tied, and they wanted the vice chair. They wanted, for their, out of the 27 they have, and there's 57 of us in total, they wanted everything. And of course, you can't do that. You're in no overall control. That's not going to happen. There was no negotiation. It was, will you support this? I said no. I felt pretty comfortable knowing if I went to the group, it was going to be a no as well. But as they were the largest group, I had no problems with them forming the administration, because they're the largest group, then they should get that opportunity. But that doesn't mean you should then be marking your homework. It's the reason, well, one of the many reasons actually, that the council is in the mess it's in now. One party had too much control and drove us into the ground. And I'd say that about our own party. Nobody should have a system where one party states emerge. It just shouldn't happen.
And I think that's not just a fair comment, but it's the purpose of scrutiny and overview boards, is that you have to look at how councils are held accountable, both to the public and internally. And it's those mechanisms, as you say, to stop people marking their own homework and saying, oh, yes, we completely agree and we've got no questions whatsoever, carry on. Because as you said, that then gets you into those positions. And I suppose that nicely segues into, when it came to the question of scrutiny and overview boards, there was obviously some criticism that came from Reform. There was the accusation of snouts in the trough, which obviously went down very well in the room. But can you explain to people who don't understand maybe what the purpose of scrutiny? You've called it there marking your own homework, but can you go into a little bit more detail about that so people understand why it's vitally important that happens?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one I will use as an example, because I think it's probably the best one, and it's the one I've probably got the most experience of, is the Children's Services and Education Scrutiny. So the idea is we have themed scrutiny panels or committees that are based on the functions of the council. So we have one for environment, we've got one for economy, one for adult social care, children's services and education, etc., etc. And then there's also the top scrutiny one, where all of the chairs of the scrutiny sit together to make sure that actually what's happening at their committees are actually working effectively. It's the councillors that put together what we think should be scrutinised, but really it's the chair that makes the decision of that scrutiny panel. So what very often would happen is you'd have what they called the work plan for every single committee. And I remember putting on a very important and really quite disastrous area of the council. I think back in maybe September 2021, it may be November 2021, but it was definitely towards the end of 2021. And it was basically around what's known as an EHCP. So it's your educational health plans that are really important for those with disabilities who need support, whether it's for education or for health, and making sure that all of the right systems are in place so that they can get the best education, so they can get on with life. And for some of them, it's also making sure that there is a long-term plan to support them throughout their lives, because they are going to have quite challenging times. These plans were meant to be done within a 12-week period and signed off within 20 weeks at the absolute latest. And we had some that have been going on for years. So I basically said, look, this really needs to come to scrutiny. And we probably need what they call a task and finish group. So the idea is that you will take something to scrutiny, you'll say, you know what, this is a big issue, we really need to look at this in more detail. And so what we'll do is we'll assign a group of people to really drill down into this, to really come up with some really significant recommendations to improve that service. So we just had one actually, incidentally, for flooding, which was actually really good. And I was a member of that, and actually really helped us kind of highlight some things that actually we could do locally that we really needed to do. So back in 2021, I raised this and said, look, this is unacceptable. We need to do it. It went on to the work plan. The little kind of like description on the work plan survived 2 chairs of scrutiny, and it made it to the 3rd chair of scrutiny before the 3rd chair of scrutiny called me up one day. And by this point, I've been banging on about it almost every meeting. Do we really need to do this? Because actually, I don't think we really need to review it right now, because actually it is improving. And when he was justifying the improvement, I think we'd basically gone from maybe 48 weeks down to 46 weeks, not making the 12 weeks at all. And yes. I'm saying to him, look, I'm sorry, no, it's got to be done. That task and finish group still hasn't been done. And very simply, the reason it wasn't done is because they didn't want us to have that conversation about why it wasn't working. It was going to be awful. I'm laughing at nervousness. I really am. It's like, I know full well what would come out of that task and finish group because I've got experience with this. And actually, it would have really highlighted some systematic errors.
And I think that's when that did actually come out eventually, when the arm's length body was reviewed and they realised that actually it was going beyond 52 weeks for plans to be reviewed and implemented. And they had a target of getting, I think it was half of them down to less than sort of 40 weeks or something like that. I think that really showed how poorly it was when they finally got that message.
Yeah, and the big issue, of course, is then Ofsted came in and basically denounced them. I have to say, I haven't read an Ofsted report that scathing in quite some time. It was fair. It was totally fair. And it was also, I have to say, having actually spoken to an Ofsted inspector about it since, she actually said that we could hear the screams that this needed to happen from the Ofsted office, that Worcestershire was in absolute freefall. We could hear the screams, and yet nothing was being done locally. And so that inspection was completely expected, and scrutiny should have had a place in pushing us away from that issue. But because one party was in charge, it is hard to scrutinise your own. I'm not going to pretend it's not. It shouldn't have been in the hands of one party. And can I just say, chairs of scrutiny were literally getting promoted to cabinet member for education, like one by one. It was ridiculous, kind of like how that transition happened. So it clearly was the same person marking their own homework.
And that is exactly what you were trying to say in the meeting with Reform, is that you can't have this happen for proper, effective governance. And to a certain extent, there is also no such thing that there is an off-limits subject to scrutiny panels. So you can refer anything. And I think that's important as well, because what we're seeing elsewhere in the country at the moment with other councils that Reform are leading or have overall control of, to have somebody else marking that homework, I think is a key part to go forward. And I would also add there that I think it's really is a check and balance on overreach. And I think we're probably going to see a lot of that in the next couple of years. Because we are seeing it elsewhere. But again, going back to your point, the Tories were able to not have checks and balances on themselves, which has led to a massive debt burden, has led to inadequate service provision across a load of subjects. So again, on that note, are you on any of the overview and scrutiny committees at the moment?
So I'm going to be back. I'm going back to. I took a year off because I have to say it was. I needed just a little bit of a break from it. I went and sat on environment for a little while, but I'm going to be on children's services and education again. I think it's the right time for me to come back. Not that I really didn't kind of move away from it, if I'm honest. Although I didn't have voting rights, I was probably at most of the scrutiny meetings anyway. And I think this is something that I think a lot of people forget is actually as members, you have a right to speak at any scrutiny meeting. So even if you're not necessarily on that scrutiny panel, you can attend. So I attended loads of meetings kind of over my first 4 years, mainly because I wanted to get the point across that residents were making. And I knew that that was one of the ways we could make use of it. It's not necessarily the most glamorous or exciting thing to kind of do on a Tuesday or Thursday morning or afternoon, but for me it was really important because it meant that actually I was in the room with the officers, with the cabinet members, actually saying, look, these are things we genuinely care about and this is what we want changed. So yeah, I'm going back to children's services this time around, which I'm really I'm actually genuinely excited about. It's going to be hard. There's a lot of things in there we really do need to fix, but yeah, I can honestly say this is one that I'm going to be pushing really hard on.
And do you find that it's actually easier to get your point across in these scrutiny panels and committees than it is maybe in full council?
Well, I think what everyone forgets is full council. The whole point of full council is effectively to vote on the decisions that have been recommended. That's where you are at that point. There's a lot of behind the scenes things that happen, which there's nothing untoward about it. It's just things have got to be kind of, created. They've got to be well researched. The officers have got to make sure it's well financed or not financed. There's got to be negotiations. There's all of those things that have got to happen before you get to full council. So by the time it gets to council, a lot of decision based things, they're already kind of in motion, if not pretty much there. When a report comes to council, that report is like a fixed thing. So I think the last one of note I remember that came in for education, you only get 30 minutes to ask questions. So there's 57 of you around the table and there's 30 minutes, quite a restricting thing. Really, the constitution needs changing because as I always point out to people, if they're not willing to sit there for an entire day for a full council meeting, they probably shouldn't actually be a councillor. That one I will agree with. But it's one of those where, we should be asking those questions, but a scrutiny based question is different to a more strategic based question. So scrutiny, you're basically going in for that deep dive. Why is it that this statistic is not right here? Why is it that 40% of people are not able to access this service at the moment? Why have we got this many complaints? Can I have a full explanation of what's happening? And very often you'll get a verbal description, but I get a lot of written kind of follow-ups because a lot of my questions, they are quite precise and I do want to know more. I once had an entire document created because I'd asked a whole series of questions at a scrutiny panel, but it actually did highlight a really big problem that needed sorting. And most officers are really keen to have that dialogue. Where it's not so effective is where it's political decisions. So, and there are political decisions, and I think this is something people have to remember is the philosophy of the party in charge will have a massive bearing on how a council operates. And so it might be you have all those conversations at scrutiny, but it's still not acceptable. And for me, the thing that was really not acceptable in education and children's services was the fact that we were ignoring parents. They were saying that they were working with parents. They said that they had a voice. They didn't. And it wasn't really until people like me started screaming incredibly loudly that their voice was then at least semi-heard. I still don't think it's heard well enough. I still think they need to, they really need to listen a lot more. But you can't do that. The council chamber is not really kind of the place where you need to push that. That's actually quite hard to get in there because it's political decision making. But scrutiny really can. You can really push that. And I have to say, parents have been fantastic at coming and asking questions, being part of that dialogue. And so it's with being smaller and more focused on what's happening, it means scrutiny can actually really drill down into the issues better. Whereas I will say now that council is always going to have that very strong political element because the decisions made are political. And anyone who tells you otherwise is basically lying. It's as simple as that.
And it's fair to say in that instance as well that scrutiny panels and committees, there is a political proportionality, I suppose is the word.
We call it political balance.
Balance, that's the word I was looking for. There's political balance there so that every party, to a certain extent, can allocate members of their group to that.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important part to comment. So even though when Reform were bashing the Rainbow Coalition for basically taking all the scrutiny chair positions, it wasn't stopping Reform from allocating people to committees so that their voices are still heard, so that their political will is still being championed through that.
That is
But
very
I
true.
think,
You've actually hit on something that actually I hadn't really thought about before, but it is really true. This idea of kind of changing scrutiny up is, for me, something I've wanted for years. So it's something that I've been looking for the opportunity to do this. I knew the Greens were on side. The Green Party were very keen to do the same. I knew independents were on side, and I also knew the Labour Party were on side because I've been banging my head against a brick wall for 4 years. I've been making it very clear that, I've been on scrutiny panels where I have been the most knowledgeable person by far and listened to some of the most ridiculous questions being asked and wondered why we're doing this. And almost it's felt like it's been sabotaged. So one of the reasons I was so keen to get the substitutes in, which really does help because it means that, I know I've got to miss one because I'm actually at a conference representing Worcestershire County Council. So I've got to be there. So having someone being able to step in for me is perfect. But the idea that you can't then say to someone, actually, you're really good at this, you should have a vote for that, made absolute sense to me. I want to be able to say, do you know what, actually, I'm just going to let you step in for this one because you really know about this topic.
yes,
But the big issue for me about this whole idea of the pigs in the trough really had me in hysterics. I mean, should we start talking about the leader of the council who was a member of the Conservatives, who's now defected to the party in charge? I mean, that's brilliant. Seriously, I think it's baffling that someone can say that when you literally have gone from backbencher Conservative to leader of Reform in the space of 4 months. Like, congratulations on getting under that table so quickly. And I have to say, there's another cabinet member who I've got to be honest, I think he's been in every political party known to man. It got to the point I was making jokes every time I saw him. I was like, he is literally, he is the Cher of politics. It's like he just renovates himself and just regenerates actually, Doctor Who. He is Doctor Who of political parties. He generates every single time. It's like, he just brings out a new album, starts singing from the hymn sheet, and off he goes. He's absolutely terrible for it. So this idea we're there doing that's unbelievable.
I did hear somebody say that if you want to know which way an election's going to go, watch this councillor because they do tend to follow the breeze quite quickly. Which I thought was an interesting commentary about a singular individual councillor who was in the running, I'm told, for leader of the Reform group and then bowed out. But yeah, I think defections is another issue I do have issues with defections generally because most people are voting for a candidate based on themselves, but also the party they represent. And if you then change party midway through, I think that's always wrong. Admittedly, with the leader of the Reform Party being a Tory, she swapped over just before the election, so she did give people a chance to either back her or not. But I personally have issues with people defecting across party lines, particularly when they go from one extreme to another.
I've always found defections quite an interesting one because you are actually elected as a person, and I think as a country we find this quite interestingly difficult to work out. So yes, I will always fly my banners. I'm never going to lie about it. But I have seen so many people across like district councils in particular who will be members of political parties, but then not tell people they are and try and run as an independent. And it's something that as a party, we've actually really had to clamp down on because it was getting really quite silly. And it's something that I think you should be honest. Like if you are, a member of a political party, say who you are and own it. Like, don't turn around and start kind of pretending you're not something that you are. But this idea of defections are troubling because I think up until about 10 years ago, I probably would have agreed with you. I think the problem is now that parties are changing while you are literally sat there. And I'm very proud of the fact that I know what a Liberal Democrat is. We're not going anywhere. We have always been what we are. We've had a few wobbles on the sides a little bit, but strictly speaking, I know what we are and what we stand for. I think if you're in the Conservative Party at the moment, I understand why they are splintering, because if you're on the kind of the Lib Dem side, kind of on the centrist side, you probably feel quite lonely. If you're on that right wing side, you actually are seeing somebody being far more successful and saying what you're already saying. So I can imagine that actually that feeling of kind of getting pulled apart, I can see why that's happening. I don't know the degree to which I'd want to start triggering by-elections every time it happened, purely for the fact that, as you've mentioned, one person, they seem to defect almost kind of constantly. I have no idea which party they're going to be in, so it cost us an absolute fortune. And there is always an election usually around the corner coming. So as much as I would want to have that by-election, I do feel a little bit like, I think if I remember right, someone told me it would up the number of by-elections. I think it would double them. And that would be a lot of time and energy and a lot of money.
Yes, and that is, again, part of the problem is these by-elections don't come cheap. And there have been a lot since May already, and there are some more coming by the look of things.
Yeah.
Worcestershire hasn't had one, and I touch wood and say yet. But they are, I think somebody quoted that they're about £25,000 per election or per candidate going forward to be selected. And that eventually adds up. And that isn't borne by a party. That isn't borne by a third-party organisation. That's borne by the county council. And that's when it then becomes a problem. Just going back to the subject that you were saying there about people being on various parts of the political spectrum. I think political spectrums in general are kind of almost condensing, and instead of going left, right, are going up and down a bit. But I had a conversation with a Conservative MP probably 3 or so years ago now, and he was describing to me where he fit within the Conservative Party at the time. It was around about the Liz Truss kind of implosion, where you had Suella Braverman and certain people heading very right, and then other people trying to bring it back towards the left or centrist a little bit more. And he put it on a bell curve, and he put himself in a certain position. And I was thinking about it the other week after the May election, because I was having a conversation with him there. And I think the Tory party has kind of flattened that bell curve because it's been stretched very, very thin. And I think you can say the same for Labour. I don't see us having that. I think we've still got quite a nice little bell curve in there. And most of us kind of fit into the real centrist positions. But it is interesting, I think, seeing how the political spectrum is changing. I wondered there, do you think that will be seen on a Worcestershire scale going forward, either within the Unitary that's coming or just within the next couple of years? Do you think that you'll see that stretch at a local level?
It's an interesting one, because I think one of the things we don't take into consideration is personal vote. And there is actually, in Worcestershire, we do take that quite seriously. And I always point out to people, I do get people who say to me they vote for me despite the fact that I'm a Liberal Democrat. I know they do, and I know that's fine. And to be honest, what I think is quite interesting is they're basically voting for somebody who will listen to them and try and fix problems. So they won't necessarily agree with all of my politics, but they will agree with my approach. And I know that happens across the county. We are a brilliant county for this. We really do appreciate people as individuals, which is a very Liberal Democrat thing, by the way. I always think it's really interesting, kind of when you look at kind of the different constituencies we have and how we work together. We are quite a diverse county. And so I would expect to see a lot of doubling down on people's philosophies. I am not going to let go of what I truly believe in. In fact, I'm going to double down. I am going to be louder and prouder about making sure that injustice and unfairness within our system is killed. And I always point out to people that, and whenever I get someone joking about kind of how I dress or the fact that I don't conform to what a politician should be, I will always use that tagline from our constitution: I will not be enslaved by conformity. And it's something that I think you will see a lot more of us doing. In terms of other parties, and obviously I can't speak for them, I think that we will find that there could be an identity crisis with some of them. I think that we're already seeing that with the Conservatives, and I think that they're not quite sure which way to go. As somebody who's lived in both a Conservative facing area like Worcestershire, but I went to university in a Labour facing area. I was in Liverpool for 8 years because that's where I did my PhD. I have seen this happen with the two big parties. They kind of almost forget who they are because being in power becomes more important than actually being who you are. But I think this time round, there is a real existential crisis for the Conservatives because Reform are offering something that a lot of their members were actually wanting, but a lot of the electorate didn't want. They were trying to get people like me to vote Conservative in 2010, which is never going to happen, while at the same time trying to keep the Reform type people happy as well, which meant that's why they couldn't win a majority. And I think at the moment, as we move towards the Unitary, I think what we will start to see is people hopefully showing what they stand up for, what they really believe. And if the only things they're talking about is stopping the boats in a landlocked county, then we know that possibly these are not the people who should be in charge of our county. Because if the only boats you're going to be stopping in Pershore are the kind of the fun holiday ones that happen on the Avon.
The little putt-putt boats as we have in Stourport, yes.
Exactly. And I think this is where, yes, I can see that the kind of the politics of the county is going to change, definitely. I don't think it's going to be as clear-cut as everyone thinks it is. I don't think anyone's going to come up with a massive landslide. I expect now, really, Worcestershire to be in overall control for quite some time. I think we're going to have to get used to this idea that all of us are going to have to be more collaborative. But I also think we've got to get better at disagreeing. And this is one of the things I always point out to people, like, you know, and I did make the joke at the last council meeting, but it is true. Like, put Lib Dems in a room and there'll be double the number of actual opinions than there are people in the room. I mean, I've never known a party like it. But we're very good at going and finding consensus before we move on. So it might be that, you know, one of you's over kind of here, one of you's over here, and you end up somewhere around there. And that's fine, because as a group, you'll get there. And in no overall control, that's what we've got to get used to doing. And you can't just turn around and call people up and say, oh, I want this. And then when you don't get it, go, oh, they're playing politics. It's like, well, they're not playing politics. They actually have an opinion and you just don't like it.
And you are standing your ground on your principles and your policy position. And actually, as you said, if somebody comes to you and says, yes, we'll adopt substitutes that you've been banging on for 4 years about, of course you're going to take that. And of course you're going to accept a degree of whatever they offer for that. I think it's interesting there where you talked about the nature of debate and the fact that people have to get better, I think, at almost disagreeing with each other, because at the moment there's a lot of anger on subjects and the immediate response is, oh, you're woke, you're too left wing, or you're too whatever. And it's easy to throw epitaphs out, but I think generally, and this is potentially where the council, as no overall control, will need to get better, is actually having those debates and understanding that you're going to disagree with each other. And I don't think that's something that people understand, because they see politics as being quite adversarial at times, particularly when you see Prime Minister's questions and they're in the background and more. And I wonder whether actually, whereas you were saying, you know, politically in the chamber, it's very different. What's it like outside the chamber in these committees about trying to get that consensus that you were just talking about?
Ooh, that's a challenging one. One of the things we have to remember is there are 57 individuals. And so you're dealing with different personalities within different parties. So I think I would probably be, of our group, probably the one who sits in the middle kind of the most. There'll be times when, yes, I do go a bit bulldog and I will defend my corner. There'll be other times when it's very much, you know what, yeah, okay, we'll have a chat. And you know, you generally know what you're going to get based on really how you've approached me. Because I'll be the first to admit, I tend to not necessarily go out looking for a fight, but I've always said, if you come at me, God help you. Because I you know, in all honesty, I will. I've got ADHD. That's free dopamine. I'm in there. So it's something that you do have to be aware of. That if you want that consensus, if you want that conversation, then you need to approach it in a positive way. What I would say is, generally speaking, if you've got complete control of a council, you don't go looking for it. Which means that the alternative is you have to start campaigning, which is what I did in the last 4 years, and actually got quite a lot of change that kind of I wanted to happen through the council, mainly through being annoying. That was basically what I did. I used the media, I got motions in, I worked with residents. I went out of my way to make sure that the things that I really cared about, so getting young people and especially preschoolers places in special educational needs, I basically spent, I think, a good 6 months of my life making sure that happened. And so went out of my way to basically campaign within the council and use the media to make them do it. Now, if there had been an avenue inside the council, that would have been a lot easier. I would have done it that way. But at the time, there wasn't that dialogue. Now there's that opportunity to. And as I've always said to people, I like a good idea. I don't necessarily am going to agree with it, but I will like thinking about it. And anything that people have, absolutely bring to the table. So we've already kind of started to get some of them, especially kind of looking at what the Unitary might look like. People are already coming to me and saying, well, this is what we want. And it's like, okay, this is one of those areas where at the moment I'm probably, of everyone in the Liberal Democrats, I'm probably the one with the least strongest view, I've realised very quickly. To me, I think it's a distraction. I want to be talking about buses and making sure education's amazing and make sure adult social care works. Those are the things I care about. This idea of kind of how the county will look or how a unitary might look in the north and south, it's very abstract. It's not very practical. For me, it's a bit like, oh, God, is this really going to help? So I know a lot of people are talking about this, and I think they quite like this idea. It's like grand designs, isn't it? Like, how do you want your council to be? And I've got loads of people.
It's a bit like playing Civilization on PC or on one of your computer games, one of the grand 4X strategy games type things.
Oddly, yes, absolutely, and this is one where I know I've got meetings over the next few weeks on it, and I've had to say to people that you've got to convince me, if I'm honest. Like, I'm probably a bit of a blank slate on it, whereas others have got really strong views and are really passionate about having a south and a north or having a whole county. They start talking about identity and kind of Malvern's quite similar to Pershore, so we've got similar views, but Kidderminster's different, but at the same time, actually, if we all work together, it might be cheaper, and it won't be cheaper. But it's one of those where it's quite an interesting kind of like conversation for some people. For myself, it's not what I got into politics for. So you have to kind of go in with an open mind, and at the same time, not kind of sit there and go, I don't care. You've really got to, you have got to go in there and kind of be, what you've got to work with people. And it's the same when I bring something to the table. On the other side, they might be thinking, oh, God, it's another one of Dan's bloody pet projects, and I'm not in the mood. And the dog's just thrown up on the carpet, and I'm going to have to get, that shampooed, and I'm not in the mood. But, we've got to get used to the fact that we're going to bring our pet projects to the table, and we've got to look at see whether we can work together to bring that forward. And especially in places like Pershore in the south, where we are very rural, we do have different concerns to say Tenbury, which is very rural but facing Shropshire, and so yes, we've all got to bring that to the table, work together, collaborate. And that's going to take us some time to understand each other and have those conversations. But as I've always said, I will have those conversations with anybody. It's just a case of whether we can get an outcome at the end. And that will mean people will have to do this thing where they'll have to say, right, this is what I want, but I'll let you have that. Otherwise, you don't get my vote.
Yeah, a proper negotiation of responsibilities and duties to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But as you said, particularly in a council of no overall control, that is a necessity rather than a nicety. And I think that's probably the one thing that people aren't understanding about no overall control, because for nearly 40 years, possibly more than that, even going back to Hereford and Worcester as the combined county, there hasn't been a situation locally where we haven't had no overall control for probably the best part of 30 odd, maybe even 40 years.
Well, good
So
sir.
this is
You're not quite right.
okay.
So yeah, it's 20 years. So it's about 20 years. So
Okay.
yeah, so we were in overall control 20 years ago. It was actually the last time that the Lib Dems were actually in administration was when we were in overall control. So it's it goes back to the good old days before the millennium. But no, it's about 20 odd years now at this point. So and I think that is part of the problem, though, is that because we've had 20 years of one party rule, effectively, it has got stale. And it's meant that people feel that they can get used to doing things. I'd also argue that it's not good for the institution because change comes in a very stabilized way all the time, which has meant we've had 20 years of the same thing happen. And then we've come to now a situation where we're in overall control. And it is quite destabilizing because we're not a system set up for it. Yeah, if you go and talk to Malvern Hills, they have basically been in overall control for so long now. I think they'd be confused if someone got a majority. They work very well as a result of that because they know exactly what comes from it. But it also means they do negotiate. They have to talk to each other. They have to get things done. And don't get me wrong, they do hate on each other every now and again because they're not getting what they want. And there's a little bit of spite and malice because somebody didn't get what they wanted. But it all calms back down again. And actually, overall, you get some pretty good democracy out of that. What we had at County Hall was no real democracy. It was a group of people saying this is what we're going to do. And I'm sorry, but some of those votes, you could see the absolute look of annoyance on people's faces. They were having to vote that way.
Yep. And I think, again, going forward, when you look at what happened at the May 22nd meeting, the fact that they were going in expecting to be able to do whatever they wanted because they felt that because they had the largest number of seats, even though it wasn't a majority, I think that frustration also boiled over not just in the chamber, but was then evident with their supporters outside of the chamber and across the country. Because we've seen the similar thing happen in Cornwall where no overall control with Reform. The Independents reached out and tried to make a deal and they didn't. So then the Lib Dems made a deal with the Independents and there was absolute uproar over that. And I think that again goes back to people not maybe having a full understanding of what a majority versus a numerical supremacy, I suppose, or that kind of content. So how would you try and explain just in a almost like a 60-second brief, why does this happen? Or why is this happening?
So this is one of those where I think in the UK we're not used to it, whereas in most other European countries it's pretty normal. Like political parties have to talk to each other, they have to negotiate, they have to say, right, I want to bring the following to the table. This is what I want to get done in the next few years. And so, I'm willing to support your government if you give me the following. And that's really standard. I mean, it's, there are so few countries now that use first past the post the way we do. When first past the post doesn't work is when you end up in overall control and you end up with, almost half of the seats with 30% of the vote, which of course means there's 70% of people who didn't vote for you, who actually don't support what you're saying at all. And you're trying to claim, well, actually all of my agenda should go through. We're in a situation now where what's going to happen is people have got to learn to say, right, this is what I want to happen. These are the things that mean the most to us. This is what will cost you for our votes. We want this. This is what our residents are saying they want. This is how we want to tackle that. That's the approach we want to take. That is a skill. And I have to say, anyone who's worked in kind of business should actually be far better at this than most of them, it turns out, are, which makes me wonder whenever they actually are buying or selling anything, a few of them I actually want to go to their businesses because I think I could get a good deal out of them.
There is an element of the Reform group that are saying because they have business people, because they have people who are entrepreneurs and doctors, as you pointed out in the council meeting, doctor counsellors, that they have a different skill set, which is great, but it depends on whether they're going to be allowed to have that ability to interact on that. And do you think looking after the first meeting and the first month and a bit, that there is going to be those opportunities to have those conversations?
I'm afraid they've made a mistake. They haven't brought different people to the table. I'm afraid I can find exactly the same occupations and kind of life histories and CVs in all of the other parties. They haven't brought anyone new. You know, the number of business owners sitting in the Lib Dems or in the Conservatives or in the Labour groups is pretty much the same. So I found it quite funny when they were kind of talking about how, you know, the councillor doctor bit. I didn't even know that was a thing until that meeting. I've been sat there as a councillor doctor for the last 4 years, not knowing I was a councillor doctor. I was like, hang on, this is amazing. Like, I thought I had to drop a title. Now I can add a title.
Your nameplate gets that little bit
exactly.
longer.
You know, let's just add it all on. Let's see what happens. But it's also part of the reason I haven't done it in the past is that, to me, like, my doctorate isn't necessarily why I'm a councillor. Like, I don't necessarily want to distinguish myself from my residents because I have the same concerns they do. Just because I've got a qualification, I do feel a little bit like that actually is creating a bit of distance between myself and those who vote for me. And I don't know, part of me is I'm not sure about that. But I also know that a lot of people have some fantastic skill sets. Not everyone in our group has a degree. Not everyone in our group owns a house. Not everyone in our group has had a lovely kind of middle class upbringing. I sure as hell haven't. And so this idea that we're all the same and a member of political elite and they're a completely different group. Can I just point out 2 of their cabinet members and their leader were a member of the Conservatives before we started this council term. So this idea that somehow they're magically different from the rest of us, I'm afraid, is complete and utter nonsense. And I almost swore again there.
We can always bleep out. That's fine.
Oh, good.
But there is this notion that we are all part of the political elite, and we're just, as you said, or what was said in the meeting, snouts in the trough and trying to enrich ourselves. I find that completely alien. No Lib Dems are known and recognised as being local champions, and the groundwork that we put in locally. I'm not elected, but I still go out and campaign. I'm still trying to raise the awareness of issues in our town. We're trying to work on things. For anybody watching, before we had this conversation, I was on the phone to another Lib Dem member talking about what we're potentially going to be doing in the next couple of days. We're out on the high street in Stourport tomorrow, just as a brief on Saturday. And we do that, and nobody else is trying to reach out to people. And I look at how we operate and find it quite amusing that we're labelled as the elite. For the exact reason what you said there.
It's like, for me, I find it fascinating because, you know, and just like for context, like, my dad was in the army, but like, who I call my dad is not my biological dad. And actually, my first memories are of a bedsit in what I now know, because my mum was an incredible person who did not make a big deal out of this, was actually in basically a drug-ridden block of flats where sex work was happening. Now, I didn't know that as a small child. I thought I had a pretty good life. Turns out, actually, my mum was just really good at protecting me. But actually, some of the things that was happening in my childhood, and, you know, I've been homeless 3 times. I have experienced some pretty ropey decision making on my part occasionally, but also just, you know, luck of the draw has meant that, you know, I've, you know, not had the finances to be able to do certain things, and, you know, my family, you know, do really graft, but it's a working class family who've had to work really hard. So the fact that I have a PhD, to my family, that's amazing. Like, basically, I've had the opportunity to get there, and although they take the mick out of it, I know that they're incredibly proud of the fact that I've been able to achieve that from my starting point. I think what really is quite offensive is this idea that because I've then done all those things, that somehow I have forgotten my roots. Whereas actually, I still live in a row of council houses. I own mine, but I know what it's like having to deal with social housing and dealing with kind of tenants, because my neighbours have to deal with it. And this idea that some of us have somehow forgotten our roots if we ever head upwards, or we're not from these groups of people, it's just really offensive. Just, oh no, you're a Lib Dem, you've got to be a part of this kind of liberal elite. And it's like, actually, hang on. Some of us actually come with some pretty serious lived experience. So actually, maybe you should listen to us rather than just call names.
And I think in many respects, and there are others within the party that are very similar to this, you are an example of social mobility that is enabled through things like equality and being given opportunities that maybe weren't present for other people, but you managed to seize them and have contributed in other ways. So I think that's actually a good advert. It's not an advert for elitism. It's a good advert for the opportunities of social mobility.
I always like the thing about I think it's from West Wing, where he basically says some of us have found the ladders and are trying to show people how to actually get up the ladder. Others found the ladder, got up, and have now tried to pull it away. And I think that's something that's always stuck in the back of my head, is that it's actually, social mobility in this country is not actually very easy. It's actually getting harder. And for some of us, we were lucky enough to either be standing next to that ladder or someone pointed us to it, and we managed to make use of it. And actually, there should be a hell of a lot more social mobility going on, and especially in rural areas. And actually, if I'm honest, white males are particularly disadvantaged here. And actually, we do need to do more to make sure that social mobility is happening in rural areas. But, the Lib Dems are used to hearing me talking about this constantly, because the second we get onto this topic, you will hear me talking about why, white males in rural areas are failing. And we're failing because we don't have the opportunities.
No, and that, without going too far back into the unitary authority argument, because that's a conversation for another time, because I am engaged with that subject in some depth at the moment. The fact that the rural south at the moment, the Severn and Avon areas, they don't have those opportunities. They don't have the kind of infrastructure in place that, say, Worcester City or Kidderminster, Bromsgrove and Redditch areas do. And that is an issue. And that's one thing I find that the Liberal Democrats in particular are really championing locally about trying to improve the rural areas. As a national party, we're trying to get more rural policing in place. We're trying to improve all the broadband speeds, all those kind of things. So I think that's where, when I put my two north and south sort of unitary hats on, that's kind of where I come from, is that actually the rural part of the county is being left behind by the more urban Birmingham overspill, as one of my colleagues calls it. And I think that's potentially one of the next fights. But I think that's definitely a conversation for another time. And probably maybe with
whole topic, that one.
But when you were saying, it's one of these nebulous kind of concepts, I think the problem we've got with that is that a decision kind of has to be made by November, or a business plan has to be put forward by November. So it is a kind of pressing need. And I don't think there's as much conversation going on as maybe there should be, but that's me.
I would say I do agree with you. We do need to make a decision. I'm mainly sulking about the fact that someone's making me do with something that I don't consider as much of a priority. But I think I personally think what will probably happen is, I think that as a party, I have a sneaking suspicion our community's hat is going to be the one we put on. And I think that will be the one which will probably win the day. I think basically we will find ourselves championing for democracy as close to the ground as possible. And actually, I agree with that, because I don't like ivory towers. I'm not a big fan of them. I don't think that having that separation between the people who make the decisions and the people who basically kind of are forced into the decisions we make are really being separate. And I think that we really do need to make sure that that all of us are as close to the electorate as possible. Otherwise, this could be a really bad decision. But the thing I've always said to people is that this idea of it all being, about cost savings, it's better, it's more efficient. A really good point was made to me last week that I hadn't really thought about. Worcester Regulatory Services is one of my bugbears. I think that it just doesn't work. I think it's too far from everybody. I can't get things to happen. I think there's like one dog warden for the entire county. There probably is more, but it feels like there's only one dog warden. And it's considering the amount of money that goes into it, it's not value for money. I don't feel like I'm getting a good service. And I'm saying that as a councillor, I feel really disappointed by them. They've come to scrutiny twice. I've been disappointed by it. I just don't think it's a service that works. I don't blame the officers. I don't think there's enough of them. I just think people have basically created what they consider to be the most efficient thing they could, but it's so distant from all of us that it just doesn't work. But actually, before we had a whole county-wide one, we had a service down this end that was brilliant. And I knew the people, I could talk to them. If there was an issue, we could just have a word. It was all fine. And it's one of those where I always say to people is that, do I want the cheapest thing ever? Do I want cheap Jaffa Cakes or do I want good Jaffa Cakes? And I'm sorry, I want good Jaffa Cakes. And it's the same with services. I don't want cheap services. I want good services. And that means if we have to pay a tiny bit more, and what I'm talking about here is £4 or £5 more a month because everyone pays collectively, I'd rather pay that and know that my next door neighbour is going to get the adult social care that she deserves when she's 82, than know that she's going to be left in her own urine, real true story, for 4 hours.
Yep.
Because the service that was being provided wasn't good enough. And, I'd hand that £4 over tomorrow if I knew that people were going to get the services that they need. And I think this is what we forget sometimes, is the county council is in charge of things that really affect people's day to day. And it's actually quite sad when you hear these stories that kids can't get into a school because we don't have the provision for them. And I'm sorry, but, it is getting worse and we need to fix that. So, yeah, we're going to have this conversation and we're going to have to be realistic. If it's all about the money, then we have to be honest with people. We're just trying to cut corners and save money, and it's not going to be a particularly good service. Or are we going to say, actually, we're going to try and get a service that's more bespoke for the areas? We might end up paying a little bit more, but at least then we'll have more direct control over it. And if we do a bad job, it's easier for you to kick us out. And I think that those are the conversations we've got to have over the next few months. But there is a consultation right now, so all is good. We can definitely tap into that consultation. I haven't filled it in yet. I'm still trying to work out what I'm going to say. Cheap Jaffa Cakes will probably be there, actually.
I would suggest I would send you my response, but we'd end up disagreeing probably. But that's fine, and that's absolutely fine. But at least I know the next time we have an in-person meeting, I will have to bring you proper Jaffa Cake.
It doesn't have to be from one brand. It's just I'm very aware that the value ones are not good quality. It's just it's not good for anybody. You want just a little bit better, just a tiny bit better than the bottom end ones.
I'm absolutely the same when it comes to sausages. There are value sausages and then there are Richmond sausages for me, and I'm a massive fan of Richmond sausages. So there you go.
Okay.
But I think that nicely brings around to the end of the conversation. We've been going for just over an hour, amazingly. So thank you very much for your input today. Thank you, a fantastic conversation, and thank you for being the first guest on the Welcome in Conversation. And fingers crossed, this is the first of many. So thank you once again, Dan. If there's anything you'd like to say to sum up, please go ahead.
Say thank you for having me. I have to say this has been, I think this is the possibly third type of one of these I've done, and this has been by far the most flawless. So bearing in mind this was the first one, I have to say I'm actually quite impressed, because I think the first one I ever did, it took us 2 hours to get the thing to work, and she'd been doing it for years, and it was like, oh, okay. So no, well done on getting this off the ground. It's absolutely fantastic, and hopefully we'll see lots of different people being interviewed.
Well, the plan is we've got lots of ideas to bring forward, and it is really about driving sort of engagement and helping people understand what's going on. We're going to be doing a few other videos. We've got a few other people hopefully lined up, but there'll also be some other content that we'll be generating for the whole of Worcestershire, and maybe getting a few special guests in as well. So fingers crossed, we'll have a lot more conversations like this on different subjects, and maybe we'll get around to having a unitary one. But thank you very much, Dan, and we'll end the stream there. Thank you. So, what do you think? Let us know in the comments below or on our social media channels. And if you've enjoyed this video, give it a big old thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our future updates and content. Thanks for watching.